The Pascagoula abduction is a classic case of UFO sighting and extraterrestrial abduction. Taking place on the 11th of October 1973, the story centers on Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, aged 42 and 18, on the night that they decided to fish from an old pier of a derelict shipyard on the banks of Mississippi's Pascagoula River. The events that are alleged to have followed are now legendary. Succinctly, the arrival of some manner of soundless, blue-illuminated oval-shaped craft, and the three humanoid, grey-coloured, wrinkled-skinned creatures which emerged from it and proceeded to abduct the two men. In the decades afterwards, Hickson and Parker struggled both to explain and come to terms with what happened to them that night, with Parker especially regarding the event as some sort of curse, which, along with journalists and thrill-seekers, followed him wherever he went. It wasn't until the later years of his life that he was convinced to revisit that terrible night in 1973 and put down his testimony, complete and unadulterated, in a book. Little did he realize that such would trigger a chain of events that would entirely validate his experience and, more than that, suggest that he and Hickson were not alone in their abduction that night, with the grey, wrinkled creatures they encountered having been seen by others on the other side of the river. Others who claimed that they, too, were abducted, taken on board the same blue-illuminated craft so as to be experimented upon and, if their testimonies are to be believed, made unwilling participants in an alien-human hybrid agenda which should terrify us all. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. By October 1973, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker had known each other for a long time. The older man was good friends with the younger's father, with it being usual for the two older men to arrange fishing trips which included not only Charles's two sons, but a young Calvin also. It was on such trips that Calvin really got to know Charles as a friend and as a person, so much so that, at the age of 18, young and engaged to be married, Calvin found himself asking his father's old friend for help to find a new job. Charles worked on the coast at a shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi, some 2 hours from where Calvin lived. And so, along with a new job, Charles provided his friend's son with a place to live also, renting him a room in his own home until Calvin settled and found a place for himself and his soon-to-be wife. Happy with the plan, Calvin made all the necessary arrangements, starting work in Pascagoula in early October. Just a few days into his new life, on Thursday the 11th, he and Charles arranged to go fishing after work. An old hobby that would bring the two men closer together than either one of them had ever imagined possible. The fishing spot they chose was just off Highway 90 on the Pascagoula River. Choosing an old steel pier to fish from, they settled down with their tackle and bait sometime after 6 p.m. It was a dark but bright night and produced little success. In his book, Calvin described how he was getting fed up and wanted to move on to a better fishing spot when he noticed something big out on the water in front of them. Further examination, and he saw blue, hazy lights akin to a police car. Only it wasn't law enforcement. It was something incredible and entirely unexpected. An oval-shaped craft about 8 feet high and fairly long, in the shape of a football. Hovering some 2 feet off the ground, it was floating towards the two men on the pier. Examining the testimony of Charles Hickson, originally published in his 1983 book UFO Contact at Pascagoula, the strange craft is described in a similar way. 8 to 10 feet high, hovering, and shaped like a football. It was also said to have been silent, with a small dome-like structure on top and no wings. In short, like no sort of aircraft Charles Hickson had ever seen before. Similar again to Calvin's testimony, the incredible object appeared to be blue, pulsating a blue light as it revolved towards the men across the water. It was then that the craft is said to have lit up really bright, after which some sort of door opened. From this opening, so the men alleged, both at the time and in the decades since, 3 humanoid beings came out towards them. Perhaps the most distinct element of the Pascagoula case, these creatures were said to have been grey with wrinkled skin. Each the same, hovering off the ground similar to the craft, they were around 5 feet tall, with heads that seemed to come directly to the shoulders, and something similar to a nose on either side of the head in the place of ears. Instead of a mouth, they bore a slit, and instead of hands, they boasted a pincer-like appendage rather like the claw of a crab. Terrified, Calvin started screaming. After all, the humanoid creatures were coming for the men and proceeded to grab them and take them on board the illuminated craft. According to their testimonies, neither Calvin nor Charles were able to resist the influence of the beings, with both men going on to have separate and distinctly terrifying abduction experiences. In order to get a better understanding of not just this sensational moment, but also the wider and ongoing story of the Pascagoula abduction, I arranged to speak with eminent UFO researcher and author Philip Mantle, a man who has not merely been involved in the case for many years, but was also the one to convince Calvin Parker to share his story in 2018. Continuing to collaborate with Parker until his death in 2023, Philip also recently published a radical new exploration of the case with co-author Dr. Irena Scott, in which old and new evidence are showcased side by side, so as to present a comprehensive, beyond reasonable doubt assessment of that night in 1973. Early on in our conversation, I was able to ask him about the beings that Calvin and Charles alleged to have seen that night, and how they are part of what makes this case not merely compelling, but exceptional in terms of the wider subject matter of UFOs and aliens.
The creatures, the beings, whatever you want to call them, that feature in the Pascagoula case, as far as I'm aware, are unique to it. And I have searched long and hard, around the world, not just in the United States, to see if I can find something similar. The way I look at it from a skeptical point of view, if you were going to hoax this, there was plenty of creatures in science fiction already out there that you could choose from. So, neither gentleman showed any artistic abilities. So, it would have been difficult for them to make this up, is what I'm trying to say. And of course they didn't, but they are very, very, very unique.
And there's lots of specific details as well, like the claw hand that they both mention. It's not just a generic strange creature. They go into the same minor details.
Yeah, I mean, right from the very beginning, there is a description of them. It gets refined as the story gets told. We have to remember that. But also, again, right from the off, all of those involved, not just the witnesses, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, but Dr. Hynek was there, Dr. Harder was on site, and others, talked about these creatures as if they were almost robotic.
And so it was, taken on board the craft by these strangely mechanical grey humanoids, that Charles and Calvin each had an abduction experience. In Charles's case, he described being restrained by two of the beings, pain being instantly felt in his left arm, after which he was exposed to a big eye which seemed to come directly out of the interior wall of the craft. The eye 6 inches from his face, he was forced to keep his eyes open as it seemingly examined him. He felt no pain or other sensations, but was absolutely terrified. So fearful was he that he longed for his life to end in that moment. As for Calvin, he was having a horrifying experience of his own. Unable to speak or move, he claimed to have floated to the door of the craft and inside into a very bright room. There, he was laid on a table at a 45-degree angle by one of the grey wrinkled beings, before being left alone in the room, after which he experienced a series of clicking noises, as well as a blue-looking square box about the size of a deck of cards, which moved around his body. Seemingly similar to Charles's concurrent experience, Calvin's entire body was scanned. He then supposedly encountered a different sort of being, smaller and less ugly than the others. This one, so he described in his 2018 book, somehow made him feel safe, even telepathically expressing to him not to be afraid. Further examination proceeded, after which Calvin again experienced a sensation of floating before finding himself reunited with Charles Hickson on the riverbank, almost to the exact same spot, only thoroughly traumatized by their ordeal.
After the encounter had happened, they actually sat down and said, "What are we going to do?" And Calvin was absolutely certain, "We are not going to tell anybody. They will think we are nuts." He was getting married in November, and as his bride-to-be was only 16, he was 18, he needed parental consent. And he says, if my fiance's father finds out about this, there's no way he's going to let me marry. He'll think he's marrying a lunatic. So they originally set off to go home to Charlie's place and not say anything. Charlie said, no, we got to tell somebody. So they came up with a compromise. And that Calvin would say, "Yes, I saw the UFO. I'll tell them that I saw the creatures come out of the door, but that is it. I'm not telling them. I'll tell them at that point I passed out." And he was literally, shaking like a leaf. Charlie, on the other hand, although he was scared, he'd actually fought. He'd been in combat in the Korean War, so he'd got life skills to fall back on that Calvin didn't. So when they reported their encounter to the sheriff that night, they stuck to the claim that Calvin, passed out.
So it was a mixture then of wanting to stay out of the public eye and not wanting to be ridiculed, but also what happened that night was quite terrifying, from what I understand, for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is the so-called secret tape made at the sheriff's department that night. And they're interviewed separately, and then they're put in a room together. And the deputy says, "I'll be back in a minute." Unbeknown to Charlie and Calvin, there's a tape recorder playing in the desk next to them. And 5 minutes later, the deputy comes back, takes something out of the drawer. They've no idea what it is. And they go and play it back, thinking, "Well, have a minute." They've been laughing and joking while they've been on their own. And of course, it was exactly the opposite. Calvin was almost in tears. He was crawling up the walls. He was saying his prayers, saying, "I want to see a doctor. I just want to get something for my nerves." And that changed law enforcement's attitude once they heard that. They then tended to believe them. So yeah, he really did suffer traumatically.
In this way, despite the attempt to keep the younger man's side of the story shielded from the public, Calvin subsequently suffered a nervous breakdown. Taken to the emergency room, he threw a wheelchair against a desk before being restrained by hospital security guards and sedated. He simply couldn't stand the stress of what he had experienced. And so, after discussing with his now wife Waynette, he decided to leave Pascagoula and start afresh.
He got married, had a family, and when somebody said, "Oh, you the alien man, can we have an interview?" he'd say, "Oh God, not again." And he would literally pack up and say, "We're moving." In one place he lived, for example, he even changed his name. And his boss called him in one day and said, "You're fired." He says, "Well, I haven't done anything wrong." So, "Well, your name doesn't match your social security number." Yeah. And he never told his story in full. He made a few, he told it right at the beginning to Dr. Hynek. And, but that was it.
Indeed, the ongoing trauma of all that he went through that night in Pascagoula even cost him his marriage. After 7 years and 1 daughter, Calvin and Waynette got a divorce. "We had no private life," he explained in his 2018 book. "I would go to work and the press would just follow me." Fortunately, the couple reunited and remarried in 1996, the same issues still present, but both older and wiser, and thus better equipped to navigate the storm together. Certainly, Calvin credited his wife with being a big reason why he decided to ultimately write his book and get the true story out there. And so, in 2018, the full details of Calvin's side of the story finally came out. When they did, the incredible happened. Others, many others, came forward claiming that they too had seen something otherworldly on the Pascagoula River that October. The most incredible of all the testimonies came from a lady called Maria Blair.
When Calvin's book was written, he came out and he did some local media and he did national and international media. And there was one little 8-minute sort of kind of mini documentary that Calvin did with one of the news companies. Somebody put it on YouTube. And there's a comment there, and in fact I read it again the other day. It says, my mum and dad were on the other side of the river that night. They too saw the UFO. Words to that effect. And that naturally grabbed my attention. So I managed to find this person on social media. It was a young lady, and I explained who I was. And I said, would your mum and dad talk to us, please? And of course, her mum and dad were Mr. and Mrs. Blair. And they were happy to talk to her. I got them on the phone, and it was Maria Blair. Maria said, yeah, my husband used to work offshore. He'd work on the oil rigs, and we were on the other side of the river that night in our car by a local pier. There was a boat there ready to take us out, but we're waiting for my husband's boss. It was late.
Maria Blair went on to explain how, whilst waiting for the arrival of the boat, she and her husband Jerry saw what she at first thought was an airplane because of its bright lights flashing. Blue in colour, it moved back and forth across the sky, seemingly lost. This was around 9 o'clock in the evening on the 11th of October 1973, and she and her husband were on the opposite side of the river to Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Incredible, to say the least. However, there was more to the Blairs' story. Through further discussion with Philip Mantle and his co-author Dr. Irena Scott, it became clear that this was not just a UFO sighting.
There was a big splash in the pier next to them, and this creature came up out of the water. It went back down again and didn't come back up, and she was absolutely terrified. And Mrs. Blair went on to say that they walked down the pier. They decided to put her husband's clothes on the boat. She literally chucked them on. Now, she said this was around about 9 o'clock. She didn't stay long because this thing had terrified her, and she ran back down to get to the car. And when she got there, it was 12 o'clock.
And so Maria Blair had not only seen a figure in the water, but had missing time too, something which, all the world over, is considered to be a telltale sign of alien abduction. In time, and after further discussions with Dr. Scott and Philip Mantle, Maria began to remember more about her experience that night, with her becoming more and more convinced that, just like Calvin and Charles, she had experienced something impossible. As for her husband Jerry, whilst he was reluctantly willing to admit that he had seen the blue illuminated craft over the water, he did not corroborate Maria's sighting of there having been a humanoid figure in and emerging from the water. Before too long, however, that would all change.
Mr. Blair eventually took seriously ill. And quite literally, he was in the hospital, sitting on his hospital bed, ready for an operation the next day, and he made his wife Maria film me. And he said, I'm sorry, Mr. Mantle, I lied. I saw exactly what my wife saw. I seen it, I seen the creature. And Maria also filmed it on her cell phone. So we have him talking, and he's sat on his bed he's got the stickers on from his ECG, no top on.
What did you think of that?
Well, it's almost like a deathbed confession.
And so it was, in a dramatic series of events, that Maria Blair's sighting of a humanoid figure in the water was corroborated, which, in combination with the missing time, supported an uncomfortable and incredible implication. That of a double alien abduction that night on the Pascagoula River. Not merely of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, but of a second set of two people, Maria and Jerry Blair, on the opposite bank of the river. Jerry Blair survived his hospital admission. He was, however, on the decline and before too long passed away. Before then, his wife was able to document, with great difficulty due to her husband's rapidly declining health, more of what he saw that night. Supposedly, he witnessed multiple figures, describing them as having been 6 feet tall and grey in colour. According to Maria's notes, 2 of them grabbed him and got control of him, after which they took him to a ship, a spaceship, where they performed an exam on him that he didn't want. As for Maria, she only remembered being outside of the craft, seeing bright, clear lights that were so bright that they hurt your eyes to look at them. The more she spoke with Jerry, though, as well as with Dr. Irena Scott and Philip Mantle, the more she supposedly remembered, until, after Jerry's death, she stated she wanted to undergo hypnotic regression so as to unlock the remainder of that night.
She came back to us after her husband had passed away and wanted hypnosis, because she was obviously upset at losing her husband. So time passed again, And she mentioned it again to us, and I said, well, okay, I'll see what I can do. I'm several thousand miles away on the other side of the Atlantic, by the way, But I found a professional hypnotherapist who would do regression and would come out to your location as well. So we did it at Calvin Parker's house. But what we didn't do, we didn't tell the hypnotherapist anything. Not a thing. We just wanted to take Mrs. Blair back to a time and a place and a location. And that is it. And that's what we did. And, the hypnotherapist was stunned.
For certainly, Maria Blair, in a state of altered consciousness, was able to recall and provide details of a shocking interaction with apparent alien beings. "I've never seen anything like that," Maria began, hypnotized, speaking of the being that she saw that night. "It grabs me." Guided by the hypnotherapist, she then went on to explain how she was floating and experienced muffled sound. Restrained, held still, she was under the control of a strange being. The entire regression was extensively documented by Philip Mantle and Dr. Irena Scott, filmed professionally, with photographs and the full transcript included in their 2023 book Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Strange and at times eerie, it was as though the beings who took Maria Blair were employing some sort of dark magic, even in that moment, to prevent her from accessing certain parts of her memory, with the hypnotherapist, so the transcript reveals, having to push past blockages to allow Maria to be able to regain control over her own memories. "It has control of me," Maria whimpered. "They're laying me on a table and they don't want me to know what they are doing." As the session progressed, Maria was able to break through the seeming mental block to tell the hypnotherapist, "They want my eggs. They put me out. I have no control of what they do. What they're doing is collecting my DNA and my eggs."
She said these creatures were interested in her eggs and her DNA, and that they wanted to make a creature that could walk on Earth and look just like us and go unnoticed. Which, to be honest, none of us ever even dreamt of she'd say anything like this.
In this way, considering all that she remembered and had revealed under hypnotic regression, Maria Blair came to believe that she was the real target that night, and that Calvin and Charles were the collateral damage of her extraterrestrial encounter. She and her husband were, after all, supposed to be at the river, at that place and at that time that night, whereas Charles and Calvin's plans had been made informally on their way home from work. Undoubtedly, all of this is not merely highly terrifying, but highly sensational and difficult to believe also.
Obviously, some of the things that Maria brought up via her regressive hypnosis, they're quite controversial even by the standards of UFOs and extraterrestrial, the idea of an alien-human hybrid. What are your thoughts on how compelling that aspect is?
Well, what Dr. Scott and I decided to do, we didn't think of a book, we were just researching it at one point, and what we realised is we just write articles, or we wrote several articles about the ongoing research and investigation. But you can only write so many articles. So we decided perhaps it might be best to put all this in a book and allow the reader to decide for themselves, so we wouldn't hide anything. I mean, literally nothing. The idea of the book, with its title, is here is our research, here is our evidence. Our only conclusion is that something really bizarre did happen that night. But you, the reader, you are your own jury. We're not out to indoctrinate anyone. You make of it what you will, because I know hypnosis on its own is very controversial.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that, your thoughts
on that. We didn't want them to undergo hypnosis. It was something Maria wanted herself. And so we obliged. It's one of those cases where it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't publish it and somebody finds out and they'll say, "Oh, what are you hiding?" If you do publish it, some people might say, well, hypnosis is a lot of rubbish. So it's a bit like taking a polygraph test. Charlie Hickson took a polygraph test, within a couple of weeks of the incident happened, and he passed. So the critics say, well, polygraphs are not admissible in court. Had he failed it, they would have called him a liar, you know. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. But it's all there, all the witness testimony, all the documents we could find, including the hypnosis, in full.
And certainly there is abundant evidence to examine in regards to the Pascagoula abduction case. In Philip Mantle and Dr. Irena Scott's book, innumerable additional witnesses and their testimonies are recorded. From those who saw strange lights whilst driving along nearby Highway 90, to a then young man who observed changes to the vegetation on the riverbank the day after Charles and Calvin reported their close encounter.
Where this UFO was, there was no vegetation there, but there was tongue to the side of it. We have interviewed, I think it's either 4 or 5 individuals who claim to have seen damage in this vegetation. It's really tall grass. The grass has a name, but this grass gets, 7 foot tall. All things are bigger in America, aren't they? Even the grass, I'll give you an example. One young guy, he's not young now, but he said back in those days, on a Saturday morning, my mum and dad would have a sleep in, and I was allowed to watch cartoons on the TV. So we'd heard on the Friday, the day after, that this thing had happened. So he said, my mum and dad are asleep. I put the TV set on and left the cartoons on and got on my bicycle and went and fetched a friend, and we bicycled to the location. And he said they were making their way through this tall grass. And he said, we just come along a part of it and that was gone. And it wasn't cut down, it wasn't burnt, it was just not there. And we've had several people report similar things. But what we do have is a lot of eyewitnesses, and people say, well, it's anecdotal evidence. Yeah, but anecdotal evidence is still admissible in court. And if there's enough of it, it can put you behind bars if you've been, naughty, so to speak.
And in many ways, this case does have enough of it. In addition to some 30 to 40 witnesses, in the course of researching his book, Philip Mantle was able to uncover compelling documentary and photographic evidence previously considered lost.
When I first started working with Calvin, I said to him, have you got any documents, photographs, anything? He says, no, nothing. He'd been hit by Hurricane Katrina. His house was under 10 or 12 feet of water and everything's gone. So, okay. So one of my jobs was to pester people politely and ask them if they got anything. Now, Hynek was down there. It was only later on that year that Hynek founded the Centre for UFO Studies. So it seemed an obvious place to start. They sent me a PDF file, mostly newspaper cuttings, but they were useful. And then in the middle of them, there was a one-page typewritten document written on an old typewriter, stated October the 13th, 1973. So it's 2 days after the encounter. And it talks about both Parker and Hickson being stripped down to their underwear and given the once-over. And he says there were puncture wounds on Hickson's arm and on Calvin Parker's foot. Both of these individuals had reported feeling these minor injuries during their encounter. And it mentioned on the bottom some photographs. Well, there were no photographs there, but this document was fascinating. And I think it was maybe a year or 2 years later, I got an email from the same gentleman at the Centre for UFO Studies. He says, Philip, I've been rooting through some files today and I come across these. I'm sure you've already got them, but I thought I'd send them just in case, And hey, presto, it was the photographs to accompany that document. And we know who it is because these are photographs and they've been scanned on both sides, and on the back of the photograph is the name of the person. So there you see, and these are very, very minor injuries on Charlie's forearm and on Calvin's foot.
Incredibly, the injuries displayed in the photographs, although minor, are consistent with the testimonies provided by both Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson in 1973. For example, Charles described feeling a pain in his left arm when 2 of the beings grabbed him so as to take him aboard the craft. As for Calvin, it was whilst he was on board that he claimed something was stuck into his foot by the alien creatures.
Make of it what you will. These are not laser incisions or anything like that. They are minor injuries.
So you did get a doctor or a couple of doctors, I think, to have a look at them as well.
Yeah. It's difficult because all we're looking at is photographs, but I did seek medical advice, but there's not a lot you can do with a couple of old black and white photographs. We've since had them colorized, but it's a physical link to what may have happened that night.
And so, once again, seemingly abundant evidence that something strange did indeed happen to both Calvin and Charles that night. Speaking more generally, I wanted to ask Philip what his opinion was on the Pascagoula case as a whole, and how what is now indisputably a classic incident reflects upon the broader subject of UFOs and extraterrestrials.
And, I don't know what more we can do. It's almost the perfect case. It really is. And we should be taking more note of it. Because when do you stop? Are you looking for the next perfect case? Well, what's the point? We've already got one here,
Even so, as almost perfect as this case is, there can be said to be one glaring missing element: motive. Whilst Maria Blair has postulated that her abduction experience related to some manner of alien-human hybridization agenda, the broader reason for why Charles Hickson was exposed to the scanning eye in the wall of the craft, and why Calvin Parker was left traumatized by a similarly invasive medical examination, eludes.
Just speculating for a moment, if we're going to say that these were actually extraterrestrial beings, why might they have done this, do you think?
Well, this is the thing about the subject across the world. I mean, I run my own publishing outfit called Flying Disc Press. The second book I published was called UFOs Over Romania by Dr. Dan Farkas. And what puzzled Dan was the stupid things that the creatures do. It doesn't seem to make any sense to do some stupid things. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would aliens come from wherever, pick up two fishermen, prod them around, put them back, and then, hey presto? I don't have an answer. I wish I did. I can't even say the word aliens. Calvin called them aliens for the sake of calling them something. Somebody said, well, the subtitle of your book is The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. It's because that's what these experiences are better known as. I couldn't put the Pascagoula weird and unknown experience. It wouldn't sound really stupid. I sit on the fence. I honestly don't know. Calvin was just looking for an answer right up to the day he died. And if I could have found a rational explanation that covered everything that we found, I would have been a happy man, and so would Calvin. But I just can't find one.
And ultimately, this might just be the most compelling aspect of the Pascagoula case: its humanity. Not merely how, in all of its complexity and intrigue, it has had the power to enthrall researchers like Philip Mantle for the past 5 decades, but also how it represents one man's struggle to find out what happened to him one night as a young man on the threshold of married life, on that one night that forever changed the course of his life. Calvin Parker did not seek, welcome, or enjoy what happened to him. For many years, he ran from it. And that was because it was very real to him. Confusing, complex, terrifying, but very real. Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed this special episode, and an extra thank you to Philip Mantle for so very graciously making time to speak with me for this video. If you want to find out more about the Pascagoula abduction, I highly recommend his and Dr. Irena Scott's book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt. It is comprehensive, contains abundant source material, and dives far deeper into the events of this case than can ever be covered in a single video. I have included links pointing to where you can purchase a copy in the description box. Thank you again. Until next time.